They are the symbols of Alberta's once robust economy. Hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells that dot the landscape. They've been drilled on farmers' fields for a century. But as the price of oil plummets, more and more wells and pump jacks are being shut down, leaving landowners wondering how to get rid of them. Here's Vashi Capellos with Alberta's costly legacy.
We live in God's country, no doubt in my mind at all. I was born here in 1968. I'm the third generation on our land. My mother's parents bought our land in 1915.
Tony Bruder knows every inch of his Pincher Creek ranch. He should. His family has been there long enough.
And so I guess we're 100 years on the landscape now. This is heaven.
It's also been over 100 years that ranchers like Tony have been sharing their land with the oil and gas industry. In Alberta, it's all about the scenery, the Rockies, the big blue sky, with pump jacks and well sites across the Prairie Province. Over 400,000 wells have been drilled in Alberta since 1915. Many on private land like Tony's.
We have 2 well sites and 7 or 8 pipeline crossings.
Multiple companies have leases on his land. This well was drilled in the 1950s and has been this way since Tony was a kid.
We'd come up here and we'd climb on the well and we'd sit here and shoot gophers off the boards.
The well produced for a couple of years but hasn't done much since the 60s.
You know, the footprint that these well sites have left on our land isn't very pretty. And just the stuff left here. And I don't want my kids to have to deal with that.
Of the over 400,000 wells drilled in Alberta, almost 80,000 are inactive, meaning almost 20% of all wells aren't producing oil or gas, but sitting on the land. Some even have trees growing through old pump jacks, leaving landowners like Tony to wonder what will happen.
Who knows what's coming up out of that site or what's going down? You know, groundwater getting in here, where is it going? Mixing with any contamination that's like, who knows what's going on with this site is my big thing.
With the number of wells like this growing, some Albertans are worried about the legacy of an industry that built the province. Barry Robinson is a lawyer with EcoJustice.
Nowhere else do we say, let's get rid of garbage collection in Calgary and just let the garbage pile up because, you know, things are kind of tight for people right now. No, we don't do that. We say it's part of a community to get garbage hauled away and properly disposed of.
Alberta's oil and gas legacy began when oil companies decided they wanted to drill on private land. Tony's father, Joe, now 94, remembers the old days.
When we were starting up, there were no rules. There wasn't one.
The companies ruled.
The company come in and they tell you, we're going to do this, and that was it. You couldn't even say no.
That's because Alberta owns the resources and the right to drill. Landowners usually only own what's at the surface, so if a company wants to extract oil or gas, they just ask the government for permission.
Well, you got paid for it, but what they decided to pay for it. Like Dad mentioned before, the one fellow told him, you own this much, we own the rest. So I have more right to your land than you do. Does that make sense? No.
Tony is paid over $3,000 a year for this site, and he's supposed to be paid until the land is restored. But there are few rules for when that will be.
How would you describe the problem that exists right now?
Well, the big problem in a nutshell is that there's no timelines. The law says you must abandon the well. The law says you must reclaim the site. But there's no timelines on either of those provisions. We're talking big numbers, just enormous numbers of wells.
The life of a well looks something like this. First, it's drilled and comes to life. Gas or oil is extracted and sold to market. If a well hasn't produced anything for up to 12 months, the province says it must be suspended or safely turned off. A company can then decide when to abandon the well. That means removing the well head and pouring cement down to seal it shut, hopefully preventing any leakage. Next, the company must reclaim or restore the land. Companies are legally responsible to pay a landowner until it's all done. When it comes to the oil and gas industry, the Alberta Energy Regulator, or the AER, runs the show. They enforce a long list of standards that all companies must follow. Kirk Bailey is their Executive Vice President of Operations.
Well, I think the important principle that guides all of our actions is that companies are accountable for cleaning up after themselves.
Accountable, yes, but when they clean up is not always part of those standards, meaning a company can leave sites like Tony's just sitting there. Almost 20,000 wells have sat inactive for over 10 years. Some landowners are content to receive their annual checks and let wells sit quietly, assuming the company will clean up when it needs to.
The good, responsible companies in Alberta are taking action. They're abandoning, they're reclaiming, and they're staying on top of the issues that exist.
I'm sure some of the government spokesmen and the industry spokesmen will say, oh, the programs are working well and the systems are working well. Well, they're wrong. And they're wrong because the numbers show they're wrong.
Lawyer Keith Wilson calls this his war room. It's where he keeps a close eye on the industry and what they leave behind.
This is a numbers game at the end of the day. These numbers show a very troubling pattern.
It costs a lot of money to clean up a well site, sometimes into the millions. And when the price of oil plummets, companies might feel the financial pinch.
So if you're an oil company, a small oil company, you decide you've got a $5 million drilling program, and you say, okay, next year we're going to take $1 million of that and we're going to go clean up 2 or 3 wells. And someone says, well, why don't we drill 2 or 3 wells and just not worry about those old ones?
It looks like a hockey stick. The growing number of well sites that have not been cleaned up, land that could be that way for a long time.
You can see how starting around 1995, when they attempted to put in time limits, the government did and the industry pushed back, we've had this huge increase in the number of legacy wells just sitting out there and not doing anything.
That's why Keith thinks timelines should become law.
So the sooner the government imposes timelines on the industry to clean up the messes that the industry has made in pursuit of an attainment of the industry's profits, the better for everyone.
The province makes its living off the oil, and the rules say if a well is to remain inactive, then it must undergo regular testing for contamination, leaking, or other dangers.
Well, the well site was a little over, but there was a shed.
Yeah.
Regulations Tony suspects weren't followed on another well site on his land owned by a second company. This one was drilled in 1959 and sat inactive for decades.
We noticed contamination right from the start. Like, as far back as I can remember, listening to Dad's stories about what was on the well site and looking what was coming off of the site.
When his cows wouldn't drink water from around here, Tony worried there was a problem. He enlisted Barry's help 6 years ago.
You know, to the untrained eye, it does look pretty good, but it's what's under there that worries me the most.
They managed to have the site abandoned last fall and are waiting for environmental testing and the land to be restored. But if timelines for reclamation had been in place, any contamination might have been caught earlier. 16 by 9 attempted to contact the companies that own his sites, but neither provided comment.
There's no doubt in my mind that we're being screwed over by this company. I'm not anti-industry. I understand we need the oil and gas industry, but we have to deal with these old problems.
Last year, the Alberta Energy Regulator, that's the AER, admitted that almost 40% of inactive wells weren't even following the rules.
You really have to ask, how did we end up with inactive wells out of compliance with the rules? Why weren't they enforcing every year when wells weren't in compliance? I think this is really about enforcement by the Alberta Energy Regulator.
But the AER says they are now taking action.
We've got a program that will see this work to completion, and we won't stop until we actually have every single well in a compliant state.
In 2015, the AER launched the Inactive Well Compliance Program, attempting to bring wells simply into compliance. Just doing that could cost industry $320 million. This well is part of that program, but Tony hasn't seen much work get done.
So when I hear these new things coming out, I don't fault me too hard for having a little bit of skepticism.
Although it can sometimes feel like a bit of a David and Goliath situation, I think our processes are designed to give voice to the landowners and to give them some power when they might otherwise feel powerless.
But critics say the program is only looking at bringing wells up to code. It's not actually abandoning inactive wells and restoring the land they sit on. Barry thinks that's the real problem.
So this is a liability that is going to end up either impacting the industry as a whole or the province as taxpayers.
Tony still receives his annual checks, but whether it's up to industry or the province, he says he'd rather have his land back.
We take care of the land, because if we don't take care of the land, it's not going to take care of us. We make our living off the land. And if we abuse the land, it's not going to be there for us to make a living off of.
Next, who pays for the cleanup when an oil company goes bust?
It just seemed to me to be kind of a bit of a circle jerk process.
Alberta will suffer considerable hardship over the next 3 years. While Ontario
oil prices seem to be dropping, consumers would ultimately pay less.
Black Monday 1987, the crash of 98, then 2008. When the price of oil drops, it's a problem, a big problem, especially in Alberta.
Oil is so prevalent here and oil seems to last forever, but certainly that's not true.
The land around Doug Lemke's property has been good to oil and gas companies.
There is hundreds of miles of pipe in this country that you wouldn't even begin to fathom how much there is underground here.
It all started out okay. When Petroglobe came to Doug almost 10 years ago, wanting to drill a gas well, Doug thought it would be all right.
They said there would be no impact to the landowner. It was supposed to be a minimal interference lease.
In exchange, Doug was supposed to receive $3,700 a year for the site.
The checks arrive, usually ahead of dates and that kind of thing. Never had an issue until, of course, 2013.
That's when Petroglobe stopped sending Doug's checks.
Ended up Googling the company to find a news release from late 2012 that they had gone into bankruptcy.
Petroglobe had run out of capital, another victim in a volatile industry.
My situation is now I'm not being paid for the 3 acres of land that they're using in this particular area. And the building just kind of sits here and takes up space. So that's kind of what I'm stuck with.
If a company goes bankrupt, who looks after the well and the money owed to landowners? Lawyer Keith Wilson says the government predicted this could happen.
What the government has said to landowners, like Mr. Lemke, is if an oil company goes bankrupt, we, the government, will pay you because we allowed them to force their way onto your farm. So come to us, the government. You bring a claim to us and we will pay you.
So Doug was confident the province would be there for him and pay what Petroglobe wasn't.
We sent in an application identifying that we had not been paid our lease agreement. Ultimately, in our mind, it was just a formality until we would receive payment from the Surface Rights Board in that matter.
The landowners have rights when it comes to dealing with wells on their property. Their rights are enshrined in the Surface Rights Act. It outlines what companies are responsible for and what a landowner is entitled to. Section 36 of the Act says that if a landowner doesn't receive payment from the company, the government might pay. The Act is upheld by the Surface Rights Board. But in Doug's case, when Petroglobe stopped paying him, the Surface Rights Board declined to award payment.
So we were kind of up the creek without a paddle, shall we say, from there.
Hey Doug, good to see you.
You too, Keith, welcome.
It just seemed crazy, inconsistent with the whole purpose of the legislative framework, which is to create balance and fairness and allow these two industries to occur and to allow the economic prosperity that Alberta has when we're on the upsides of our cycles. What we're trying to achieve through this case is to make sure that the safety net that we believe was supposed to be there, me and other lawyers, will actually be put back in place so that you won't be left out of pocket with this abandoned industrial site on your property, on your farm.
Gerald Horonic is chair of the board that declined Doug's application. an independent body that rules on issues facing landowners and the Surface Rights Act, including non-payment of rent.
If an obligation or a recommendation is made to the minister to pay the lease price, the Crown is owed the money, and the Crown takes the place of the landowner.
In Doug's case, the Surface Rights Board decided that money owed before the bankruptcy could not be paid because the company was under the protection of the Federal Bankruptcy Act.
It's all done on a case-by-case basis. We look at the facts of each individual case.
Keith says each case may be different, but that interpretation doesn't make sense.
So the simple fact of the matter is, Mr. Lemke, Mr. and Mrs. Lemke, are not creditors of Petroglobe against the government. They're a creditor of the government.
Isn't there an assumption, I guess, by a lot of landowners that they're guaranteed their money?
There's discretion in the board. There's no complete guarantee. So it depends on the facts.
Keith says decisions like Lemke's break the social contract made between landowner, industry, and government. Some are calling for a full review of the Surface Rights Act and Section 36 applications.
Is to protect people when the problems come up. And we're seeing, in the instance of the Lemke case in the Surface Rights Board, the government effectively turning its back on the landowner.
Over the last 10 years, the government has paid almost $7 million in non-payment decisions. Gerald says applications will increase as the industry struggles.
Is it possible for the burden then on taxpayers to increase as a result of that?
Oh, it will. It could.
The board reviewed Doug's case and upheld its decision, but says while there are no guarantees, Doug can make a new application for all missed payments.
It just seemed to me to be kind of a bit of a circle jerk process.
But it's not just about Doug, it's about his land and the wells Petroglobe has left behind.
And you can see all of these dots are wells. Many of these wells are with Petroglobe, which is now bankrupt.
Petroglobe owned dozens of wells. Here's one, and another. Wells that could now be called orphans. And unlike Tony Bruder in Pincher Creek, who has a company he can pressure to clean up the site, Doug feels like he has no one to turn to.
You see, this is another example of what's left of Petroglobe here. This could be here forever. It's just not right. It's totally criminal as far as I'm concerned.
The oil companies are put in a position to make huge profits. Good for them. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is when they're taking those profits at an excessive level, distributing them out to shareholders in executive compensation of millions of dollars, and many millions, multiples of millions, and not cleaning up the mess.
It's the Alberta Energy Regulator's job to make sure each well is looked after. Executive Vice President of Operations Kirk Bailey says as technologies like fracking advance, it is possible an old well could be retrofit to be profitable again.
So there's an argument to be made that these wells should be left in a suspended condition, which allows them to be restarted.
But Kirk also says the longer a well sits, the more unlikely that could happen. And if the price of oil drops too low, an inactive well could find itself without an owner.
There was the potential for bankrupt companies to leave a trail of assets that weren't being properly managed, and action was taken. A mechanism was put in place to protect Albertans from that financial burden.
That mechanism is called the Orphan Well Association. And if a company wants to drill a well in Alberta, they must pay into the Orphan Well Fund to help reclaim the land after companies go bust.
So can you tell me about what we're up to today?
Pat Payne calls herself a garbage lady. In reality, she's the manager of the Orphan Well Association.
That's what I do, is I seem to pick up the garbage. We pick it up and we clean up after the oil and gas industry. Yeah, it's not the sexiest name, that's for sure.
And cleaning up can be a huge task. It means testing for contaminants, removing contaminated soil, and hauling in topsoil. Well pipes are cut off below the surface, and pipelines are usually left in the ground. 16x9 joined Pat on this site just past Red Deer, Alberta. The company went bankrupt in the late 90s, and the well was abandoned 10 years ago. She thinks it will take 5 more years to finish this job.
I think we're doing the best that we can with what we have, and what we're really seeing is things take time.
In 2014, Pat had 162 wells to clean up. This year, it has quadrupled to 704. And that's on top of the over 500 sites like this she has on her plate.
What we tell the landowners, it took a long time for the site to get into this condition, so we're going to need that time to put it back and return it to equivalent land use.
In 20 years, Pat has managed to clean up just 700 sites. And even though industry has doubled her budget to $30 million, it could still be decades until Doug gets his land back.
How do I get the land back, to where it's land and not an oil company lease?
Remember the hockey stick? Keith says Pat can only tackle a fraction of all the unreclaimed land in Alberta.
Another important thing about this chart is if you look at the Orphan Well Association, which is in place to deal with these problem wells, their capacity to deal with wells is about there. In other words, if they went full out this year, at best they're going to get about that many done, a sliver. So they're completely under-resourced. The problem is greater than their capacity.
Which is why some landowners want timelines in place to make sure companies clean up before they go bankrupt.
That's what ticks me off the very most about this. This should have been dealt with 30 years ago.
Only the provincial government can create those timelines, and they're a long way from Pincher Creek.
Why is the Alberta government allowing that to happen?
16 by 9 went to Edmonton to ask the new NDP government if inactive wells are even on their radar.
I'm very concerned about the environmental legacy that we have inherited from the previous government.
Minister of Environment and Parks Shannon Phillips is quick to point out that they didn't create the problem.
We have heard about these issues over the period of essentially what amounts to a generation. I call them the big boogeymen of my file.
But she's short on specifics with how hard they'll push industry to clean up.
Are you willing to bring in timelines to force compliance, to force reclamation and abandonment issues?
Right now I'm examining our options on precisely that. We know we have to get the balance right. This is a time of economic uncertainty.
But what is certain? Oil prices will continue to fluctuate, and Tony and Doug will have to keep waiting to get their land back.
I'm angry at the process and how things transpired.
I want these jobs done before this gets passed down to the kids. I don't want them to have to deal with this crap.
Coming up next week on 16 by 9, First Nations fighting for what we all take for granted, clean drinking water.
The city of Winnipeg was growing at the time, and they decided to look for water elsewhere, so they thought they can just take the water from here. We certainly were not involved in any kind of negotiations. It was more or less just take without asking.
That cement area where the rails are over and above it, is exactly where the water pipe is that goes to Winnipeg.
We still live the consequence of that decision to this day, 100 years later.
You're surrounded by water, but do you remember a time when you would have just drank from the lake?
Oh yeah, I remember that like it was yesterday. Our septic fields are leaking into the water system that eventually goes back into the houses.
We don't have clean water, but yet we're the supplier of clean drinking water to the city of Winnipeg.
Basic rights like water we don't have. These little ones, they know nothing but bottled water.
And you're about to see our water department. A lot of children don't know how nice it must be to drink out of the tap.
All our discretionary funds are going towards access costs. You know, that should not be. We should be building houses, improving our education system. Give us some infrastructure like this road that we desperately need to be self-sustaining community. We always were, and we have, we can be again.
The possibilities are endless once we have that road, but right now, without a road, the excuse of why they don't want to build us a treatment plant is because there's no access for things to get here.
We hope you'll join us for that story next week on 16 by 9. In the meantime, that is our broadcast for tonight. A reminder, you can always connect with us on Facebook and Twitter or at global16by9.com. I'm Carolyn Jarvis. From all of us here at 16 by 9, thanks for watching.